was going to start this off with like the typical hype up YouTuber intro. Something like, this build will turn you into the fire god, planet Earth. This build is so overpowered, it'll make your dad come back with the milk. Alright, it wasn't exactly like that, but I hated how I sounded. So I'm going to leave this here instead of what I had before, in a hope that it's at least more genuine. I'm not gassing this build up as much as others would probably do, but I promise you, it's so worth your time. It's really strong and it is so much fun. It's a long vid, so grab a drink, get some food, but it's worth it to stick it out, because at the end you'll have a build that you just won't want to take off. Anyway, I've been yapping for too long, let's actually get into this build. This build all kicks off with the Athrys' Embrace exotic arms, which on landing rapid precision hits will give you the strengthened heavy knife buff for 10 seconds, with any precision hits after that adding more time up to a max of 30. With this buff active, your weighted throwing knife will deal 200% increased damage, stun unstoppable champions, and you'll gain 50 passive strength whilst the buff is up. You can only be pairing these exotic arms with the weighted throwing knife melee, as it's the only knife that benefits from the bonus damage of Athrys'. However, this knife comes bundled with a load of unique abilities that you really wouldn't want to be running anything else in its place. This throwing knife has a 1.5 times increased precision damage scaler. It will ignite any scorch target on hit, no matter how much or how little scorch they have, and on a precision kill, will fully refund our class ability energy. Ding. And segueing into it, you definitely want to be running the Gambler's Dodge with this build, where on dodging near an enemy will fully recharge your melee. Already, just between these two abilities, as long as there is something that you can get a precision kill on with your knife, you won't have a cooldown between these two, as your dodge will be refunding your melee, and your melee will be refunding your dodge. Before going on to the aspects and fragments, I want to cover the exotic weapon this build uses, as it plays heavily into how we use our throwing knives and why we're running certain fragments. In this build, you have to be using the conditional finality. I've tried subbing this gun out for others like 1-2 punch shotties and tractor cannon, but no other weapon comes close to having synergy with our build like this one does. This exotic shotgun holds 2 shots, with the first dealing stasis damage and the second dealing solar. If you land almost all pellets, you will freeze and ignite respectively. We are going to be relying on the first shot of conditional to set up a combo with our knife. Due to frozen targets taking an additional 2.3 times damage while frozen from our melee, we can combine the freeze from conditional with the damage buff from Athrys', meaning from just 2 exotics, our itty bitty base throwing knife has gone from hitting like this to hitting like this. Like what you saw? Well, it only gets better from here, because we're about to talk about our For the first aspect, you'll want to take Knock 'em Down. This will give you an enhanced super, which pairs nicely with Blade Barrage, the super you'll be taking with this build. But more importantly, and the main reason we're running this aspect, is that while Radiant, Throwing Knife Final Blows will fully refund your melee energy. This means we'll want a reliable way to become Radiant, and where we'll pick our first fragment, the Ember of Torches, where powered melee attacks make you and nearby allies radiant. This is doing 2 really important things in this build. One, this is, obviously, giving you Radiant, which is a flat 25% weapon damage boost and gives you a really consistent way to break barrier champion shields in high-end content. But more importantly, and I'm gonna put myself in subtitles here so it is crystal clear, Torches makes it so that when killing an enemy with your knife, even if you are not Radiant, when throwing the knife and you get a kill, the knife will refund itself thanks to Knock 'em Down's melee reset mechanic. This means as long as the knives we throw are killing targets, and they normally will be because of how much damage the Athrys' conditional combo, or even just the damage Athrys itself adds to the weighted throwing knife does, this build will be permanently resetting its own melee cooldown. The second aspect you'll be picking for the build is Gunpowder Gamble, which on solar weapon or solar ability kills will charge up what is essentially a throwable ignition. Just remember that although this is thrown like a grenade, it is coded as an ignition, super important for some stuff coming up later. I do want to note that Gunpowder Gamble works on a tier system, with weapon kills adding 1 pip, Scorch and Ignition kills adding 3 pips, ability kills adding 4 pips, and your super fully charging it on a kill. And as this build has such a reliance on our throwing knife, i.e. an ability, Gunpowder Gamble will be off cooldown a lot. It's also worth mentioning that Gunpowder Gamble does have a cooldown when thrown, where it cannot be charged up. Now, there is a bug that removes this cooldown, but it's exactly that, a bug, so I don't want to dedicate time to it for a build guide that I pretty much want to be evergreen. For the second fragment, you'll want to add in the Ember of Empyrean, and alongside this fragment, you'll also want to take the Healing Grenade, which is where the survivability of this build becomes way stronger. When throwing the Healing Grenade, it will apply Cure to anyone near where it's landed, and leave behind a ball which when picked up will apply Restoration for 4 seconds. But with Empyrean, any solar kills will extend Radiant and Restoration, with higher tier enemies granting more seconds added to the timer, capping at 15 seconds. And for the last 2 fragments, we're using the Ember of Ashes, which will increase Scorch stacks we apply by 50%, and the Ember of Char, which will cause our ignitions to spread Scorch. For now, just add these fragments into the build, as I'll cover why we're running these in the gameplay segment of the build later. Moving on to the mods and stats you want for this build, I'm always going to say tier 10 Resilience is your priority, then Discipline, then Intellect, then after that, it's really up to you. I wouldn't, however, recommend building into Mobility too much, just because this build already has a really efficient way of resetting your dodge through your knife, that it's really just wasted stats at that point. For the helmet, I'd recommend the Special Finder mod, as Conditional is a key part of the build, and it lets us keep our combo up more reliably. Then Hands On for more super energy on melee kills, and Harmonic Siphon for orbs on rapid solar weapon kills. On your arms, I'd recommend Impact Induction for grenade cooldown on powered melee hits, and Heavy Handed to make an orb on a powered melee kill. If you do want to use a loader mod here, go for Harmonic Loader, as Conditional can only reload as a solar weapon, and will therefore only benefit from a harmonic or solar reload mod. On your chest, you'll want resistance mods, matching whatever activity you're going into. It is worth mentioning that if you want to go for a reserve mod for Conditional, you will only get bonus ammo from stasis reserves and not solar reserves. Although I'd recommend solar over stasis, as you'll most likely be running a solar heavy, which I'd argue is better to have more ammo on. On your legs, I hard recommend 2 solar surge mods for 17% additional bonus damage to your solar weapons. And your class item is flexible, but I personally run Reaper for more orbs, distribution for ability energy, and powerful attraction just as a quality of life mod. And for any spare energy you have in your armor, just put in stat mods that push up resilience, discipline, or intellect, with priority in that order. As for weapons to use outside of Conditional, make sure that solar is the flavour of the guns you're using. Both Gunpowder Gamble and Ember of Empyrean require solar weapons if you're wanting to either get more charges towards your Gunpowder Gamble, or extend your Restoration and Radiant timer. As for specific weapon types, I recommend either a solar SMG, auto rifle, or a pulse rifle. This is purely just so you can get your Athrys' buff as quickly as possible. This is not to say that other weapon types can't work here, just that these ones have the fastest way of getting precision hits quickly to get you to your knife buff. And for weapon perks, you really want to be looking for Incandescent, as it gives your knives even more opportunities to cause ignitions. In your heavy slot, this is really up to you. I'd again recommend solar, but as for what weapon, pick what you like the most. I couldn't blame you for wanting to go pure damage with a reconstruction bait and switch Apex Predator, and I couldn't blame you if you wanted to go for an aggressive frame solar fusion or an LMG to be able to proc the Athrys' buff with your heavy weapons. And that's everything as far as what makes up the build, from super to weapons, fragments, aspects and abilities. Now we can actually get into piloting this build and showing off why we're running what we are. I really want to start off by saying that this build thrives with a more aggressive playstyle, as your combo relies on being up close to get the freeze off, and your uptime on restoration relies on you chaining kills together. You really need to be in the thick of fights to get this build going. And whilst Athrys' Inconditional is the foundation of the build, the healing grenade is like the glue that holds everything together. For something that's supposed to support your team, it enables you to be aggressive in a way that literally no other grenade will. But it completely depends on your ability to keep that restoration buff up. So always try and make sure that there is a high mid-tier enemy that will extend your restoration timer for a greater chunk, or a big group of low-tier ads that you can kill. I really commonly just throw a gunpowder gamble into ads, and just before it explodes, throw the healing grenade at my feet, or just before throwing my knife in the conditional combo, I'll healing grenade my feet. Different ways of doing the same thing, which is adding time to your restoration clock, which keeps you healthy and being able to brawl really well. I cannot tell you enough how important restoration is in enabling this build and its combo in high-end master GM content. Genuinely, the difference between playing this build well and playing this build badly is being able to keep this restoration buff up. As for using Gunpowder Gamble, there are two things that you should be looking out for in your gameplay. 1. Be so aware of when you're about to throw a Gunpowder Gamble or when you're about to throw a healing grenade. Genuinely, more times than I would like to admit, I've thrown a Gunpowder Gamble at my feet thinking it was a healing grenade, it kabooms and I game end myself because I was being an idiot. The second is that the ignition shot from conditional, if the pellets don't kill an enemy, but the ignition after does, it is not counted as a weapon kill, but an ignition kill, meaning 3 pips for any enemy killed by it, added to your Gunpowder Gamble charge. On the flip side of this, the first shot of conditional is coded as stasis, and will give you a grand total of nothing. Just something to be aware of in your games. Now, you've been seeing it throughout the clips in the background, but your combo is as simple as get precision hits, freeze, throw knife. However, if there's an enemy that has a massive health pool, it's really easy to do this combo twice in a row and come out with it with all of your abilities fully recharged by just doing the following. You get Athrys' buff, you freeze, you throwing knife, you dodge, you get Athrys' buff, freeze, throwing knife. And you should get a rotation that looks like this. And to square this up in a damage comparison, this is an Izanagi's Burden with Catalyst on a sniper rifle surge death. When I said at the beginning of this video that this build was fun and really strong, this is what I'm talking about. Taking your knife from something that's kind of, just okay, into hitting harder than an Izanagi's, it gives you such a good dopamine hit every time you do it. It's literally like the pure hunter fantasy, just throwing knives that hit like absolute trucks. And even though this build is focused around high single target damage as well, it still has such good ag clear. It's kind of difficult to give you every way that this build can ag clear, but the main gist of it is that your ignition spreads scorch, and your scorch will cause ignitions, which will spread scorch, which will cause ignitions, and so on and so forth. It's one of those things that you have to do in game to really understand the synergy between your abilities and how they play off one another. And finally, a few tidbits on the weighted throw knife. Not really a complicated tip here, but don't be afraid to use this outside of the conditional combo. It'll one-shot red bars, it's an excellent tool for cleaning up high health enemies, and it is by far your most reliable way for causing ignitions. There are 2 important things to look out for though. Firstly is that if you spam the knife back to back, you might not get your melee refunded. If you listen to this clip closely, just after the knife lands, you'll hear the sound of the knife landing, which I can only describe as sounding sharp, and then you'll hear another sound, almost like a wind-up click. Take a listen. Any knife thrown before that clicking sound will not reset itself from knocking down. It's like the game giving you a heads up that you're good to throw your knife again once you've heard it. Another thing to be careful is your knife not resetting against scorched targets. If you take this clip for example, I throw the knife, it kills, but my knife does not refund itself. This is why Gamblers is so important in the build. I can immediately dodge to get my knife back, and then precision kill with my knife to get my dodge back. This bug doesn't happen loads, but when it does, being able to reset your dodge and knife straight after makes this more of a small inconvenience than a game-breaking bug. And now let's talk about these. I've been hesitant to mention any of the seasonal mods I use because this build will do absolutely fine without them. If you're watching this in a few months' time, post Season of the Wish, the core of this build will stay perfectly intact. It is still a perfectly viable build to use. But if you're watching this during Season of the Wish, we have got some seriously powerful artifact mods to use at the moment that this build can heavily take advantage of. Firstly is Flint Striker, which is a natural pairing for the build. It will grant you Radiant for 10 seconds when landing rapid precision hits. You're already encouraged to go for precision hits with this build anyway to get Athrys' buff, so getting Radiant just from doing what you would have been doing anyways is just a nice bonus. Revitalizing Blast adds the weakened effect to a target hit by solar ability damage, which really in this build is just a nice damage bump. It's only a 15% debuff, but it's nice for boss DPS rotations and why in some of the clips in the background you'll see me throw a gunpowder gamble before doing my conditional combo. We do have two stasis seasonal mods that we can benefit from because we're using conditional finality, which will freeze on the first shot. Firstly is Hail the Storm, which will make shattering an enemy deal 12.5% more damage and makes crystal shatters deal just under 30% more damage and release small stasis shards that hit enemies when destroying a crystal. We can also use Pillar of Ice, which on killing a frozen target will spawn 1 to 2 stasis crystals depending on what tier of enemy they are. These mods aren't really that impactful in the build, but there's still some nice additions. However, where we really start to see our gameplay modified is in Rays of Precision, which while Radiant will cause precision kills to cause an ignition, and Kindling Trigger, which while Radiant will cause our solar weapons to apply Scorch to unscorched combatants. Rays of Precision fits so well into this build, as it's on precision kills, not weapon precision kills, meaning our weighted throwing knife can take full use of this seasonal mod. Kindling Trigger will get its own in-depth breakdown in a second, but your SparkNode's TLDR version is that you can apply Kindling Trigger Scorch, then cause an ignition with your knife. It is, at the moment, the most consistent and reliable way to cause a guaranteed ignition. Just shoot once, apply Scorch, throw knife, ignition. Although before I move on to breaking it down properly, little disclaimer. I know this is getting a bit on the long side, but there's one last section I want to break down, which is on Scorch stacks, ignition thresholds, and chain ignitions. If you just want to end the video, copy the dim link in the description and just go use this build out in the world, go for it. You by no means need what's coming up to run this build well, and these are probably things that you'll just figure out with time anyway. It's just useful information to know that will help you understand the why and how of what some of the build choices are for and how to make your ignitions more effective. That being said, this is where I cover chain ignitions and kindling trigger interactions, so it might be worth your while to stay for that. Cool? Sound good? If you're still here, let's do some numbers stuff. Firstly, I want to set the baseline understanding for Scorch and ignitions, and then why we're running Ember of Ashes and Ember of Char. At base, an ignition occurs when Scorch stacks reach 100. The way I like to think about ignitions is not that Scorch hits 100 and an ignition goes off, but more like you reach 100 Scorch, and that Scorch is consumed and turned into an ignition. It's a small difference, but an important one for something coming up. Now, because of Ember of Ashes, we are applying 50% more Scorch stacks, and because of Char, every ignition is now spreading Scorch. So what does this affect in our build, and how much does each Scorch source increase by? Kindling Trigger goes from 30 Scorch up to 45. Base Incandescent goes from 30 Scorch up to 40. Crafted Incandescent goes from 30 Scorch up to 45. Erase of Precision Ignition goes from 40 Scorch up to 60. A Gunpowder Gamble Ignition goes from 40 Scorch up to 60. And a Weighted Throwing Knife Scorch Proc Ignition goes from 40 Scorch up to 60. This means we can apply any two ways of getting Scorch together to make an ignition go off, apart from Kindling Trigger and Incandescent together, as this only reaches 85 to 90 Scorch. Apart from that specific combo, anything else goes. As long as it's reaching 100, you'll get an ignition. Just always keep in mind that any ignition, no matter its source, will spread 60 Scorch. And this is where Kindling Trigger becomes a powerhouse in our build, as it's going to let us double ignite targets when doing either of the following. Kindling Trigger into Weighted Throwing Knife into Kindling Trigger will cause 2 ignitions. And Conditional, while Radiant on the second solar shot will cause 2 ignitions. In both cases, Scorch never reaches 100 twice, meaning 2 ignitions shouldn't be possible. But something with Kindling Trigger is making this interaction possible. We don't need to fully understand it, we just need to know that it is repeatable, and as such, something we can build into. These double ignitions now mean that one target can by itself ignite anything standing near it, because both ignitions will spread 60 Scorch, causing an ignition to anything nearby, as long as they've got the health to live through it. If you take this clip for example, you can see that the Gladiator spreads 60 Scorch twice to the champion behind it, causing an ignition. And this double ignition tech isn't just for ads. You can add this into your boss damage rotations as well. I'll run a clip in the background of me doing an 8 ignition chain, but in order to do this you have to do 2 double Kindling Trigger ignitions with Weighted Throwing Knife, 1 conditional double ignition, and 1 Kindling Gunpowder ignition. I'll try my best to single out the ignition damage in the clip, but listening will also help if you can't see the damage numbers too clearly, because ignitions have quite an obvious sound cue, so you might be able to better hear when the ignitions are going off just by their sound. As a quick add-on, I do just quickly want to get one thing out there. This 8 ignition chain is for demonstrating that it is possible and is not what a damage phase should look like when you are using this build. During DPS phases, I will always hard recommend that you rely on your heavy and weapon swapping and work in these ability combos if you think you have the time to. But don't prioritize ignitions over emptying out your heavy, because your DPS will genuinely suffer for this. Anyway, take a look at the clip. I do want to end this build guide off with 2 important tips about the Kindling Weighted Throwing Knife double ignition. Firstly, this double ignition has to have very precise timing. When I mentioned in the beginning about ignitions consuming Scorch to turn into an ignition, this is where that's important. If you apply Kindling, then Throwing Knife, and try and apply Kindling again before the ignition goes off, the second one will not happen. And also just be aware that the same goes for the reverse of this. If you wait too long after the first ignition to apply Scorch with Kindling Trigger, then the second ignition will not go off. And nothing. That's it. 10 pages worth of script, hours of getting footage, learning how to edit, albeit really badly from scratch, but spending so long at messing around with OBS audio and video encoder settings. Oh, having my RAM memory almost die from literally rotoscoping like a 10-second clip. all just for some stupid hunter build about throwing knives. If you're still here and you've been here from the beginning, all I can say is I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I do, and any and all feedback is welcome. Like, did you think pacing was too slow? Could I have been more clear with descriptions? Bloody 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 blah. You probably get the idea. I should probably also do some like YouTuber stuff. Like the video, I guess, if you actually enjoyed it. Comment too if you like the build. I don't know. Like all the call to actions, that stuff. Oh, one other thing I do want to say is that all the music used is down below in the description, but it's all taken from my VGM playlist 1, 2, 3, 4 and VGM playlist favorites. It's literally been like the only thing this channel was doing before this video. Like not so much of like the funk jazz stuff you would have heard, but still some really good tunes, so you can check that out if you want to. I don't know, it's up to you. Anyway, that's about it.